The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, heavy and unyielding, like the stroke of fate itself. The packed courtroom fell silent, every eye locked onto the man seated at the defendant's table. Daniel Carter. His deep-set eyes showed no trace of fear, no hint of desperation, only an unsettling calm, as if he already knew how this trial would end. How could an ordinary man remain so composed when staring down a verdict that could destroy his life? Across from him, Officer Mason Briggs stood tall, a man of apparent integrity, praised as a model officer, delivering his testimony with unwavering confidence. This man attacked me. He tried to take my weapon. I was simply carrying out my duty as a protector of this community. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some nodded in agreement. Others, particularly those all too familiar with cases of police misconduct, remained silent, their gazes fixed on Daniel, waiting for his reaction. Something wasn't right. Daniel Carter did not protest. He did not explode in anger like so many falsely accused before him. Instead, he smiled, a knowing, cryptic smile. Then, in a moment so tense it seemed to suffocate the room, he leaned forward, placed both hands on the table, and locked eyes with Officer Briggs. His voice was steady, yet it sent a chill down every spine. If I try to take your gun, then why do I have a video proving otherwise? The air turned to ice. Officer Briggs froze. The prosecutor stammered, scrambling to object. Objection. This is undisclosed evidence, completely inadmissible. But before the judge could respond, Daniel Carter reached into his pocket and retrieved a small USB drive. He set it on the table with deliberate precision. The dim courtroom light reflected off its metallic surface, and in that instant, everyone could sense it. A storm was coming. A horrifying truth was about to be revealed. Within minutes, the world would see the real victim. They would see the real predator, hiding behind a badge. But the biggest question of all remained. Who was Daniel Carter? An innocent man? Framed? Or someone far more dangerous than anyone had imagined? Like, share, and subscribe to Golden Story, because this tale will make you question everything you thought you knew. Welcome to the truth. But be careful, because the truth can kill. Chapter 1. An Unusual Trial. A heavy rain poured down on the roof of the city courthouse, raindrops shattering against the dull gray pavement. Outside, a sea of camera lenses pointed at the massive wooden doors, waiting for them to open. In just a few minutes, one of the most controversial trials of the year would begin. The media had been following the case for weeks, running headlines that stirred public debate. Cop attacker or victim of the system? Daniel Carter, a dangerous man or a framed innocent? Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters whispered among themselves, camera shutters clicking incessantly. In the front row, a group of uniformed officers sat upright, their eyes cold and unwavering, fixed on the defendant as if he were a wild animal that needed to be subdued. At the center of it all sat Daniel Carter, the accused. He remained motionless at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Unlike most defendants in his position, he showed no anger, no nervousness, no desperate protests of innocence, only silence. A silence so heavy, it was as if he was not merely waiting but calculating. He did not glance at the jury. He paid no attention to the restless crowd behind him. His sharp, steady gaze was fixed on one person alone, Officer Mason Briggs. Briggs sat at the plaintiff's table, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. A smug confidence lingered on his face, the kind that belonged to a man who knew the system would protect him. Despite the gravity of the trial, he maintained a slight smirk, as if this was just a mere formality before his inevitable victory. Briggs was not just any officer. He was one of the most respected law enforcement figures in the region. The media portrayed him as a dedicated protector of the community, a frontline officer in high-stakes situations. He had reputation, support from his fellow officers, and backing from city officials. Today, he needed just one more thing, a guilty verdict for Daniel Carter. The gavel struck. The judge, an older man with silver hair, glanced at both sides before speaking in a firm, authoritative voice. "We will begin. Prosecutor, you may proceed." A middle-aged man in an expensive suit rose, his voice steady and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we present a simple case. A police officer was brutally attacked while carrying out his duty. The attacker, the man seated there, Daniel Carter, attempted to seize a law enforcement officer's weapon. He took a step closer to the jury, his gaze sweeping over them as he emphasized each word. This was an act of violence, an act that cannot be tolerated in our society. And we are confident that, once you have seen the evidence, none of you will have any doubt about the defendant's guilt." A few jurors nodded slightly. Behind them, the silent officers watched, waiting for the trial to unfold as they expected. But what puzzled everyone in the courtroom was Daniel Carter's reaction. He said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't object. All eyes were on him. Yet he offered them nothing to latch onto. No fear. No anger. It was not the silence of a frightened man. It was not the silence of a desperate plea for innocence. It was the silence of a man who knew that the real game had yet to begin. Chapter 2. The Officer's Accusation. A perfect story. Under the cold stage lights of the courtroom, the air was heavy, as if bracing for a performance that could not be undone. All eyes were fixed on the evidence table as Officer Mason Briggs stepped onto the witness stand. His posture was rigid, his presence commanding, a symbol of authority and strength. He was ready to deliver the truth that, in his mind, would prove Daniel Carter's guilt beyond a doubt. Briggs began his testimony with a voice that rang with certainty. Around 9 p.m. that night, I received a call about a disturbance in the old district of the city. I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary night. Every word from Briggs seemed carefully crafted, as if rehearsed for hours beforehand. He painted the scene in painstaking detail, each moment described with surgical precision, ensuring that his audience felt the gravity of the situation. When I arrived at the scene, he continued, I saw Daniel Carter causing a commotion in the street. He wasn't just standing there, he was shouting. And when I ordered him to cooperate, things escalated quickly. His words echoed like thunder in the already tense atmosphere. The courtroom seemed to be transported back to that chaotic night, where every second was filled with disorder and violence. Briggs pressed on. As soon as I approached, he charged at me. According to witness statements, Daniel tried to grab my gun. In that split second, in order to protect myself and those around me, I had no choice but to use force to subdue him. His voice grew stronger, more resolute, as if every syllable carried the weight of undeniable truth. The so-called witnesses conveniently present at the scene were called to the stand one by one. With solemn expressions, they delivered their statements, each supporting Briggs' account. One witness, voice trembling yet firm, testified. From a distance, Daniel Carter didn't look like a man under attack. He looked aggressive, and when Briggs arrived, he started acting erratically. Briggs' narrative was flawless, crafted with precision. Everything, from his testimony to the witnesses' statements, pointed in one direction. Daniel Carter was the aggressor, a threat not just to an officer, but to the community itself. This, Briggs declared, his confidence unwavering, is a clear case of resisting arrest. When a person challenges law enforcement, decisive action is necessary to maintain order. Every word, every tone of his voice was calibrated for effect, to construct an airtight story, a story that left no room for doubt about Carter's alleged danger. The force behind Briggs' words seemed to command the courtroom, as if compelling everyone to accept the truth he presented. As he stood there, fortified behind the wall of his testimony, he exuded an air of certainty so strong that it was difficult not to believe him. But not everyone was convinced. A few in the audience, those familiar with stories that didn't quite match official reports, exchanged skeptical glances. Still, in that moment, no one dared to challenge the authority Briggs wielded so effortlessly. For Briggs, this trial wasn't just about justice. It was a stage, a battleground where he showcased his power. He wasn't merely a witness. He was a warrior defending the honor of the force. Every word he spoke was infused with conviction, that justice must be upheld, and that those who defy the badge would not go unpunished. Meanwhile, the witnesses continued to reinforce his narrative. They stood by their testimonies, insisting that Briggs' actions were justified, that they had seen the events unfold with their own eyes. "I remember it clearly," another witness said. When Briggs approached, Daniel looked like a cornered animal. He had no way out. The statement solidified the image of Briggs, not just as an officer, but as a guardian of order, a protector of the law. When the prosecutor emphasized that Daniel Carter's behavior was a clear act of resistance against law enforcement, the words rang out like a direct challenge to the very notion of individual freedom. Amid the relentless chorus of accusations, Briggs was certain that his version of the truth had been established beyond question. And in his mind, there could be only one outcome, an undeniable conviction. But outside the walls of his testimony, an unseen tide was rising, waiting to wash away the carefully built facade. The details of Briggs' account, no matter how meticulously constructed, were still waiting to be examined under the harsh light of truth. And as the moments passed, the tension in the courtroom grew like a fire, ready to consume the illusion of a perfect story. The evidence table was no longer just a place for presenting testimony. It had become a battleground of belief and reality. The witnesses, with each sworn statement, contributed to a portrait that, depending on who was looking, could depict either a violent offender or a man caught in the grip of a system determined to bury the truth. Between the subdued applause of Briggs' supporters and the silent, questioning stares of others, a different story was beginning to take shape. A story not just about an officer or a suspect, but about the power of authority, the distortion of justice, and the fine line between truth and a carefully constructed lie. In that moment, the air in the courtroom was so thick with tension that one could almost hear the pounding of anxious hearts. Every eye, from the spectators to the jury, was filled with a single, unspoken question. Was this perfect accusation truly the whole truth? Or was it nothing more than an elaborate illusion designed to conceal something far more sinister? Officer Briggs, with all his strength and confidence, believed he had cemented his legacy, a hero, a defender of the law. But even as everything appeared to be going his way, a shadow of doubt lingered in the room. Was there something beyond the stillness of the evidence table? A story yet untold? A truth waiting to shatter the narrative he had so carefully built? As Briggs concluded his testimony, the weight of his words still hung in the air, reverberating through the silence of the courtroom. His was a perfect story, just as he had intended. But was it enough to persuade everyone? Daniel Carter remained silent, his lack of response an unspoken defiance against everything Briggs had claimed. And outside, beyond the courtroom walls, the tides of truth were stirring, waiting for the right moment to crash down. Before the trial's end, each person in the room would have to ask themselves, beneath the surface of a perfect accusation, was there a reality yet to be uncovered? Did Daniel Carter's silence contain answers that Briggs dared not acknowledge? And above all, was justice truly being served, or was it merely another performance in a much larger game? With every accusation, with every statement, the case grew murkier. This was no longer just about resisting arrest. It had become a battle between two forces, a well-crafted narrative and an unspoken truth waiting to be freed. A battle where every word, every gesture, held the power to alter not just the verdict of a trial, but the fate of a man. Within the cold walls of the courtroom, as the dim lights flickered over the hidden shadows of truth, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. And as the gavel struck, another chapter in the story of buried secrets was about to unfold. Chapter 3, The Defendant Strikes Back. A heavy silence blanketed the courtroom. Not the silence of a trial nearing its conclusion, but the silence of a storm brewing, a moment everyone could sense yet no one dared to acknowledge. Daniel Carter, the man accused of attacking a police officer, sat calmly in the defendant's chair. He showed no signs of distress, no anger, no urgency to defend himself. He didn't say a word. He only smiled. a smile that had no place on the face of a man staring down a severe conviction. At the prosecution's table, Officer Mason Briggs clenched his fists beneath the desk. His jaw tightened at the sight of that expression. He was used to seeing suspects shake, plead, or lash out in rage. But a man smiling? That was not normal. The prosecutor cleared his throat, breaking the strange tension that had gripped the room. Keeping his professional tone, he spoke. "Mr. Carter, it is now your turn to speak. If you have anything to say in your defense, now would be the appropriate time." Everyone waited. The journalists' cameras and recorders were primed. The jurors leaned forward ever so slightly. Several officers sitting behind the prosecution table crossed their arms, expecting a weak, flustered defense. But Daniel didn't respond immediately. He took his time, his gaze sweeping across the room as if savoring the moment, as if he were enjoying the tension he had created. Then, leaning toward the microphone, he finally spoke, his voice low, steady, laced with an unsettling certainty. "I have nothing to defend." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A few jurors raised their eyebrows. The prosecutor smirked in triumph, and Officer Briggs allowed himself a brief, satisfied grin. "Well then," the prosecutor said confidently, "if the defendant has no argument, we move to—" But Daniel cut in, his voice calm, yet commanding. "Before you conclude, I have a question." The prosecutor hesitated. Daniel tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with the prosecution's table. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the courtroom like a sharp blade. "I wonder, why hasn't the police dashcam footage been presented as evidence?" The air shifted. The prosecutor flicked his gaze toward Briggs. 1 second passed, then 2. He quickly regained his composure, but in that fleeting moment, those paying close attention saw it, the flicker of unease in his eyes. "The police dashcam footage?" the prosecutor echoed, keeping his tone neutral. "Unfortunately, the recording from that night suffered a technical failure and is unrecoverable." A blow landed on the trial like a hammer. Whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. The jurors exchanged glances, some frowning. The reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just been handed tomorrow's headline. Daniel's attorney, who had remained silent until now, slowly stood. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, just to clarify, you're saying the dashcam, which records the entirety of an officer's shift, conveniently malfunctioned on the exact night of the incident?" The prosecutor's jaw tightened. "That is correct." A pause. Then Daniel Carter laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't mocking, but it was enough to send a chill through the room. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, fingers drumming lightly against the wood. His gaze traveled from the prosecutor to Briggs, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, Daniel said, "Well, what if I told you? I have a copy." Silence dropped like a guillotine. Someone in the audience sucked in a sharp breath. A police officer accidentally knocked a pen off the desk, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The jurors turned to each other, their eyes wide. The prosecutor was momentarily frozen, caught completely off guard. Officer Briggs looked like he had just taken a bullet to the chest. No one moved. No one dared to break the moment, because everyone in that courtroom knew exactly what had just happened. If Daniel truly had that footage, Briggs' entire testimony would collapse. The entire case would collapse. The prosecutor blinked rapidly, forcing himself to recover. His voice came out sharp, edged with barely restrained tension. "What did you just say?" Daniel tilted his head, his smile still there, calm, dangerous, entirely in control. "I said," he repeated, "what if I have a copy of the dashcam footage?" The judge narrowed his eyes, elbows resting on his desk, as he measured his next words carefully. His tone was slow, deliberate, piercing. "Mr. Carter, do you have such evidence?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His gaze never wavered from a judge's. "I suppose," he said, voice carrying the weight of an undeniable shift in power. "We'll just have to find out, won't we?" The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted over one another, scrambling to capture every word. Fingers raced across keyboards. The crowd murmured in frantic discussion, some people standing in shock. Briggs had gone pale. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape. The prosecutor turned to him, his expression dark with silent accusations. And Daniel Carter, he remained seated, composed, smiling, like a predator that had just led his prey into a trap. The trial would continue, but now, the game had changed. Chapter 4. The shocking evidence. The missing footage was no accident. The air in the courtroom had thickened, heavy with anticipation. Everyone could feel it, the silent dread of the inevitable. No one spoke, but they all knew they were about to witness a moment that would be remembered in history. Daniel Carter remained seated, calm, unwavering. Slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black device, placing it on the table before him. I think it's time we all saw the truth. The judge narrowed his eyes. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice sharp with irritation. "Mr. Carter, you have no right to introduce evidence like this without following proper legal procedures." Objection overruled. Daniel's attorney cut in immediately, his tone steady but firm. "This evidence could determine the integrity of this trial, Your Honor." A long pause. Then the judge nodded. "Proceed." Daniel pressed a button. A large screen descended at the center of the courtroom. Every pair of eyes locked onto it. The air was so thick with tension, it was suffocating. Then, the footage played, not from a police dashcam, but from another source. And it showed everything. For a moment, the screen remained dark, accompanied by a brief, static noise. Then, the scene flickered to life. A dimly lit street. A police cruiser parked at the curb. A man walking down the sidewalk, minding his own business. That man was Daniel Carter. And then, another figure appeared. Officer Mason Briggs. In the footage, Briggs stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on his weapon. His voice rang out, clear and confrontational. "What the hell are you doing here?" Daniel stopped, his expression calm, his voice composed, devoid of any aggression. "I'm walking." "Is that a crime?" Briggs moved closer, his hand never leaving his holster. "I told you this area is a problem. Guys like you don't belong here at this hour." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. A few jurors sat up straighter, their mouths slightly open. This was not what Briggs had testified. And then, the undeniable happened. Briggs shoved Daniel. Daniel stumbled back, but remained composed. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Briggs didn't care. He stepped closer and slammed his fist into Daniel's chest, knocking him to the ground. Then, with chilling precision, Briggs drew his baton. "Hand where I can see them, punk." Daniel didn't fight back. He lay there, breathing heavily, staring up at the officer looming over him. But Briggs wasn't done. He grabbed Daniel's arm, twisted it behind his back, and then, in a loud, clear voice, he shouted, "Resisting arrest." "He tried to grab my gun." The footage cut out. No one spoke. Everything Briggs had testified, every word, was a lie. The prosecutor's mouth hung open, at a loss for words. Officer Briggs looked like he had just been drained of all blood. Whispers turned into outcries. "You lying bastard," someone shouted. Briggs turned to the prosecutor, panic in his eyes, but he found no help there. The prosecutor refused to meet his gaze, as if he too realized the inescapable truth. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but no one was listening anymore. Then, another sound cut through the chaos. A man stood up from the audience. A middle-aged man with graying hair, dressed in a sharp black suit, walked steadily toward the center of the courtroom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. "I don't believe this trial is over just yet." All eyes turned to him. His voice was deep, authoritative, carrying the weight of a revelation that would shift everything. "I'm Lieutenant David Monroe, Internal Affairs." He let the words sink in before continuing. "And we've been investigating Officer Briggs for quite some time." Briggs froze. A cold shiver ran down his spine. What?" Briggs stammered. Monroe took another step forward, his gaze unwavering, heavy with long-awaited justice. "He didn't just fabricate Daniel Carter's arrest," Monroe said, his voice like steel. "He's been involved in multiple cases of corruption, unlawful force, and evidence tampering for years. A bombshell. The officers in the courtroom stirred. Some exchanged glances. Some looked away in shame. They all knew, if this was true, the entire department could come under investigation. Briggs shook his head frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. This is a setup. They're framing me, but no one believed him anymore. Not after what they had just seen. Across from him, Daniel Carter stood. The man who had been falsely accused. The man who had stayed silent until the perfect moment to strike. Slowly, he adjusted his jacket and stepped toward the witness stand. He tilted his head slightly, locked eyes with Briggs, and spoke just one sentence. "It's over, officer." Chapter 5. The Great Secret Exposed. The courtroom exploded like a bomb had just gone off. Shouts, camera flashes, frantic murmurs. Chaos erupted in every direction. No one in the room had expected to witness such an earth-shattering takedown in the middle of a trial. At the center of the storm, Lieutenant David Monroe stood firm. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that could not be denied. Briggs didn't just frame Daniel Carter. Monroe paused, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room, as if assessing every individual before he continued. He is also connected to a network of corrupt officers operating within this very department. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Several officers in the back rose, shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others lowered their heads, their hands unconsciously clenching into fists. The reporters, frozen in disbelief for a moment, suddenly realized they were sitting on the biggest scandal of their careers. But no one reacted more violently than Mason Briggs himself. Lies. This is all a setup. Briggs slammed his fists on the table, his face burning red, his eyes wild. Was it rage? Or was it panic? He looked around, desperately searching for an ally in the room, but all he saw were cold, doubtful stares. Everything was crumbling. "You think I'm going to believe this bullshit?" Briggs snarled, his voice unsteady in a way he couldn't control. "Monroe, you made this up. Someone's trying to take me down." Monroe remained still, his face unreadable. "We've been investigating you for a long time, Briggs." "That's impossible," Briggs roared. His voice no longer carried the authority of a man in control. It was the voice of a cornered animal. The problem was, he wasn't just alone in this courtroom. He was alone in his own army. A few officers avoided his gaze. Some even took a step back, as if they didn't want to be anywhere near the fallout of his downfall. Briggs realized it, and for the first time since this trial began, real fear settled into his eyes. Monroe calmly pulled a thick folder from his briefcase, tapping it lightly before speaking again. "We have statements from officers who used to work with you, officers who left the force because they refused to be part of your corruption. We have records of cash transactions between you and organized crime figures. We have emails, messages, and proof that you tampered with security footage in multiple cases, not just Daniel Carter's." Monroe turned his piercing gaze toward the jury. In short, Mason Briggs isn't just a dishonest cop. He's a criminal hiding behind a badge. Briggs' confidence shattered like glass. "You can't do this to me. I'm a hero. I protected this city." He spun toward the prosecutor, grabbing his arm like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "You have to do something. You know I'm not like this. You know me." But the prosecutor merely looked down and pulled his arm away in silence. Briggs had been abandoned. Everyone in that room had chosen a side, and no one stood with him anymore. Throughout Briggs' entire meltdown, Daniel Carter remained seated. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk in triumph, as many might have expected. Instead, he rose slowly to his feet. Step by step, he walked to the witness stand, stopping just inches away from Briggs. The man who once wielded untouchable power now trembled like a leaf in a storm. Daniel tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with Briggs. And in a calm, steady voice, he said, "Justice always finds the truth." Briggs had no response. He just stood there, frozen in place, his eyes clouded with the unbearable weight of reality crashing down on him. A long silence stretched across the courtroom. And then, the judge's gavel struck, and an empire fell. Chapter 6. The Climax, when a hunter becomes the prey. The judge's gavel struck like a death knell. Officer Mason Briggs, This court orders your immediate detention for further investigation into allegations of misconduct within the police force." The words hit Briggs like the ground had just vanished beneath him. His eyes darted wildly around the courtroom, searching, desperate, for anyone to save him. But all he found was silence. Behind him, several officers shifted uncomfortably. One adjusted his collar, another refused to meet the judge's gaze, and a few slowly edged away, as if trying to distance themselves from what was about to happen. They knew, if Briggs went down, he wouldn't be going down alone. Two officers stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. In front of the entire courtroom, they clasped them around Briggs' wrists. A moment no one could have ever predicted. Just minutes ago, he stood as a symbol of authority. Now, he was a criminal, his face contorted between rage and fear. "You can't do this to me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I've served this city for over 20 years. This is a goddamn joke." No one responded. Even the prosecutor, who had once stood by his side, took a quiet step backward, his expression blank. The judge fixed Briggs with a firm, unwavering stare. "We operate on evidence, Officer Briggs. If you are truly innocent, this system will determine that." But everyone knew those were just words of procedure. The truth was already out. Briggs had nowhere left to run. As the cold steel of the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, Daniel Carter remained seated at the defendant's table. He stared at Briggs, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a calm, unreadable expression. And then he smiled. A small, subtle smile, but it was enough to make Briggs shiver. Then Daniel leaned toward his lawyer, his voice low, almost like a quiet acknowledgement of a long-played chess game finally reaching its checkmate. "I've been waiting for this day." For the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor looked away from Briggs and turned to Daniel. He frowned. Something wasn't right. Up until now, everyone had believed Daniel Carter was just an innocent man, a citizen wronged by the system, a victim who had been lucky enough to escape an unjust conviction. But now, the way he said that, the way he looked at Briggs like he was just another pawn in a larger game, it sent a chill down the prosecutor's spine. And then, the secret was revealed. Daniel Carter was not just an innocent citizen. He was a former undercover investigator for the government. And Briggs was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Daniel's lawyer rested his hand on the table, tilting his head toward the prosecutor, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of satisfaction. "I believe it's time for the prosecution to re-examine my client's records." The prosecutor clenched his jaw, but reluctantly flipped open Daniel Carter's file. Then he froze. His breath hitched. The document had been redacted. Key sections blacked out. No clear birth records. No detailed employment history. Just one chilling line stamped across the page. "Classified, United States Government." The prosecutor's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Daniel Carter was not a normal man. He had worked for the government, and he had only just begun. As Briggs was dragged toward the exit, his panic escalated into sheer terror. He had thought he was the hunter, but now, as he looked into Daniel's unwavering gaze, he realized he had been the prey all along. He stammered, his breath ragged. "You planned this from the start." Daniel simply stared back, that same enigmatic smile lingering on his lips. And as Briggs was pulled away, Daniel leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice low but crystal clear, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "I didn't have to plan anything, Briggs. The truth always finds its way to the surface." The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Briggs. Silence fell once more. But it was not the silence of a trial ending. It was the silence before a storm. Because if Daniel Carter was not just an ordinary citizen, how many more Briggs were still lurking in the shadows? And more importantly, what would Daniel Carter do next? Chapter 7, the finale but not the end. The judge's gavel struck one final time. The court finds the defendant, Daniel Carter, not guilty. All charges are hereby dismissed. The verdict echoed through the courtroom like thunder in a storm. The crowd erupted, not in shock, but in the sheer weight of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just another trial. This was history. On the other side of the room, in stark contrast to the relief surrounding Daniel, Mason Briggs sat motionless. His eyes were hollow, his body frozen in the nightmare he could not escape. A police officer stepped forward and unclipped the badge from Briggs' chest. Everything he had built, his reputation, his power, the respect he commanded, was stripped from him in an instant. Officer Mason Briggs, you are officially suspended. You and several of your colleagues will be subject to an internal investigation for corruption and gross misconduct. The officers who once stood beside him remained silent. Some turned away as if they had never known him. Briggs tried to speak, to argue, to plead, but no words came out. No one was listening anymore. A pair of officers placed a firm hand on his shoulder, signaling it was time to go. With no fight left in him, Briggs lowered his head and disappeared through the doors. Daniel Carter remained still. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He didn't gloat. He simply buttoned his jacket, took a deep breath, and turned to leave the courtroom. As the doors swung open, a blinding wall of camera flashes greeted him. The press surged forward, a storm of voices and questions. Daniel, how does it feel to be exonerated? Did you anticipate Briggs' downfall? Are you planning to sue the police department? But Daniel didn't answer. He walked past them, his steps steady and unwavering, never rushing, never slowing. Then, one reporter, a young woman, broke through the chaos and stood directly in his path. She didn't yell. She didn't demand an answer. She simply looked him in the eye and asked one question. Who are you really? Not how do you feel? Not what's next for you? But who are you really? For a brief moment, the crowd fell silent. They waited. The cameras zoomed in. Daniel stopped. He met her gaze, and for the first time that day, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not pride, something real. He smirked, just slightly, just enough to leave him guessing. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, he simply said, I'm just someone who doesn't believe in lies. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of people, leaving behind a story the city would talk about for years to come. As the final echoes faded into darkness, one final line appeared on the screen. Justice doesn't always win, but when it does, the world takes notice. Black screen. The end.